It's the 7th of November 1944. Flying low over a Yugoslavian valley, a group of P-38 Lightnings spot a column of lumbering vehicles. The leader quickly orders one squadron to start a strafing attack, while a second remains in the high cover position. The troops on the ground are hit hard, with many trucks being destroyed, but before the Americans can celebrate, a call comes over the radio: enemy fighters below. One P-38 is already going down, surprised by the sudden arrival of other aircraft over the twisting valley. Another P-38 soon latches onto the offending fighter, and sends it down to the ground alongside its smoking victim. But something seems wrong. The twisting fighter in the Americans' gun sight isn't adorned with black crosses and a swastika. It's carrying a bright red star on its tail. Russians. It would take minutes for the Allies to realise their mistake and stop shooting. Unfortunately, lives would be lost on both sides that day, and the Soviets would demand the head of the man responsible, Colonel Clarence T. Edwinson. But what had led to American P-38s attacking Russians on the ground and in the air on that day in November 1944? It would not have been a surprise to either the Americans or the Soviets that the other nation was operating over Yugoslavia that morning. Having been checked in their Novgorod-Luga offensive earlier in 1944, the Soviets had begun an invasion of the Balkans that September. It was a bid to flank the Wehrmacht and push them further back into Germany herself. As they advanced into Romania, Hungary and then towards Bulgaria, each nation was toppled and a government sympathetic to the Soviets installed. This brought Romania and Bulgaria onto the side of the Russians and against their former German allies. Overwhelmed, German forces in the region beat a hasty retreat across Yugoslavia in a hope to rejoin the fight further to the north. This brought them firmly into the range of the US 15th Air Force, operating from southern Italy. The Americans would fly 35 tactical missions in support of the Soviet advance into Hungary and then Yugoslavia. After a successful mission on the 6th of November, the Soviets had asked the Americans to launch a similar sortie the next day. The target would be retreating Germans in the Kosovo region of Yugoslavia. The 82nd Fighter Group was again detailed for the mission, which was one of 3 P-38 units attached to the 15th Air Force. The 3 squadrons, namely the 95th, 96th and 97th, were led by Colonel Edwinson, the man the Soviets would later blame. Before we get into today's story, I just want to quickly tell you about something pretty amazing. I'm sure that, like me, you've always found the stories of the air crew during World War II absolutely thrilling, and I'm sure you've also thought the following: man, those flying jackets look pretty cool. Now, with the great deals from legendary USA, you can get your hands on an authentic B-3 or RAF style bomber jacket. Real sheepskin, real warm, and a real fashion statement. But wait, are you more of a fighter jock? Don't worry, I've got you covered too. Why not get your hands on a genuine leather A2 flight jacket? Just add some shades and you'll feel like a real flying tiger. There's a whole range of jackets for men and women, and at really affordable prices. All jackets are made in the USA and are shipped all around the globe. I've got mine in the post already. If you want to know more about the absolutely fantastic deals available with my link that even your better half can't argue with, then check out the details above or in the description below. Now, let's get back to the story. Clarence Edwinson was a very experienced pilot. The 32-year-old had been awarded his wings in 1936 and had spent considerable time as an instructor. Witnessing the Battle of Britain as an observer in England in 1940, Edwinson had also flown operationally in Alaska. By the time he took over command of the 82nd in August 1944, the colonel had amassed 4,000 flying hours and clearly knew his stuff. On the morning of the 7th of November 1944, the plan was to repeat the successful ground attack mission carried out the previous day by the same P-38 group. Flying from their base near Foggia in the Puglia region of southern Italy, the Americans were headed for Yugoslavia. The Soviets had launched their invasion of the southern European region earlier in September, the ultimate goal being the liberation of Belgrade. Progress had been good. In one of the few opportunities for direct military cooperation, the Americans had supported the Soviet advance into the Balkans by launching pinpoint ground attack missions. That November morning, the idea was to continue this good work. So far, very little aerial combat had been experienced on that side of the Adriatic Sea. None was really expected on this sortie either. Edwinson had been ordered to patrol the Ibar River Valley that winds itself northwest from the modern Kosovan capital of Pristina. The Germans had been using the road networks that ran alongside the picturesque river as an escape route north through Serbia. Flying at 12,000 feet, the 82nd Fighter Group had flown a rough course northeast over the Montenegrin mountains into the Serbian river valleys beyond. As they crossed the modern-day border between Montenegro and Serbia at Bijelo Polje, the 96th broke off. Spiralling down, they began strafing the road between Sjenica and southeast towards Novi Pazar. The 95th and 97th Fighter Squadrons remained at 12,000 feet and headed further east, along the valley, towards Raska. As the 95th spiraled down, they spotted a train towards the north, near Meglic, and promptly destroyed it. Meanwhile, the 97th Squadron had remained as top cover for the other two formations, climbing to 14,000 feet. The 95th Squadron then carried out a patrol over the Ibar River Valley, ranging from Raska in the north towards Pristina in the south. This is when they came across a column of what they believed to be retreating Germans entering a village on the road below. The problem was that they were not, so it would seem, flying along the Ibar Valley. In fact, they were further to the east, flying along the much larger Yuzna-Moravia River Valley, about 60 miles off course. The village below was actually the town of Niš. Rather than meeting the retreating enemy, they had found an advancing column of Allied troops. As the P-38s poured bullets into the Soviet convoy, they killed at least 30 soldiers and injured at least another 30. Significantly, among the dead was Lieutenant Colonel Grigory Petrovich Kodtov, the corps commander. It was a huge blunder, though understandable in the confusion of an ever-changing ground war being fought by a coalition of different but united nations. What was to happen next would escalate the mistake into a dangerous geopolitical incident. As the 95th Squadron pulled up from their strafing run, they passed over an airfield to the northwest of Niš. Pilots from the 97th Squadron called over the radio that unidentified aircraft were taking off, underneath the climbing P-38s. As one became airborne, the fighter lifted its nose and shot a stream of deadly lead at one of the Lightnings. The P-38 erupted into flames and crashed to the ground, killing the pilot, Lieutenant Phil Brewer. Without hesitation, another P-38 latched onto the smaller fighter and shot it down. On the ground, the Soviet troops had not expected to be attacked from the air. The Germans were in full retreat and little enemy air activity had been encountered. Some sources say that the P-38s were misidentified as Focke-Wulf 189 reconnaissance aircraft. This might be possible and would have explained any Soviet anti-aircraft fire directed at the Americans. Others say that the Russians quickly identified the Americans as allies due to the white stars painted on their machines. Whatever the truth, fighter cover was soon called for. In the air, as the dogfight began, many of the Americans also soon discovered the true identity of the aircraft they faced. Lieutenant Kenneth Kachka, who had downed the Russian who had killed Phil Brewer, spied the red star on its tail as his bullets drove into the aircraft. "They're Russians," he called over the radio. The P-38s were being attacked by a mix of Yak-3s and Yak-9s. Colonel Edwinson attempted to break off with his group, but some of the Russians remained aggressive. Another Lightning was targeted by a Yak, and was soon shot down by Lieutenant Blumer. Despite attempts to signal the Russians, the attacks continued, and yet another P-38 was shot down, killing Lieutenant Sid Coulson. Lieutenant George Bowers, who was heavily engaged with one determined Yak, was dragged across the Soviet airfield, perhaps in a hope that Ak-Ak would shoot the American down. Crossing the airfield, Bowers dropped his nose and strafed still more Russians taking off to join the fight. The dogfight was becoming more and more intense as the Americans tried to escape the vengeful fire of their Soviet allies. Yet still more Americans and Russians either didn't know who they were fighting or couldn't safely disengage. Eventually, it's reported that the leader of the Soviet squadrons, Ace Alexander Kordanov, bravely flew alongside Colonel Edwinson. By means of wing waggling and hand signals, they established the other's identity, and the two allies parted ways. In the 15-minute battle, there were losses on both sides. The Soviets claimed 4 P-38s down to a loss of just 3 Yaks. In American reports, 2 Yaks were destroyed, 2 probably destroyed, and 1 damaged. They claim only 2 Lightnings were shot down by the Russian fighters, while 1 was lost to flak. Other local reports from the ground suggest as many as 7 P-38s didn't make it back to base. It had been an almighty cock-up, and the Russians were out for more blood. Arriving back at their base near Foggia, all pilots involved were interviewed and a picture of the disaster was pieced together. The Russians wanted the man responsible to be severely punished. Some rumours even suggest they wanted the man shot. That man was Colonel Edwinson. The American government formally apologised to the Soviet Union, but Edwinson was not to be tried and executed for the foul-up. He was instead sent back to the States, where his career continued, without any negative effect from the incident. Rather than turning the terrible error into a media bloodbath, the events were hushed up as the effects on morale could have been very serious. This was especially true amid claims that the US had deliberately attacked the Soviets, as it was their 27th anniversary of the October Revolution. Personally, I find that accusation a little far-fetched. Also, had the Germans gotten wind of the American attack on Soviet forces, they would have tried to use it to undermine the alliance between the two nations. Despite being allies, Joseph Stalin did not entirely trust the Americans, and the beginnings of the coming Cold War were already forming as the two nations sought to destroy the Nazi regime. So what had gone so wrong? Quite simply, it was a navigational error. The P-38s were about 15 or 20 minutes off course, which resulted in them attacking a road 60 miles or so further to the east. This could quite easily have been the fault of Colonel Edwinson, who we must assume was leading, who had messed up his timings between waypoints. It could equally be down to stronger than anticipated tailwinds that pushed the P-38s further into Soviet-captured territory. Weather in the region in November is often wet and cloudy, though the mission report suggests a ceiling of at least 14,000 feet. I'd strongly doubt Kavok conditions, and just from personal experience living in Bari for a year, we did get snow in December, so it can get pretty chilly around that time. Looking at the map, I would say the Americans mistook one mountain range for another, and also misidentified the crossroad town of Novi Pazar for another further to the east or north. Once down in the valley, identifying landmarks would have been more difficult, especially at the highest speeds the fighters could achieve. There is also some blame to be laid at the door of the Soviets. Reportedly, they had not communicated to the Allies the speed at which they had advanced across Serbia. The Americans would not have expected to find them near Niš that morning, even if they knew that was the location they were attacking. The Soviet column they attacked had nothing clearly identifying them as Russians, and perhaps the Americans simply saw what they were expecting to see, fleeing Germans. This was a feeling expressed in some of the debriefing interviews and few declassified reports on the event. Ironically, this is one of the only times that American and Soviet forces had openly engaged each other. If it proved one thing, it was that the P-38 could easily take on the nimbler Yak-3s and Yak-9s sent up to engage them. It would seem possible that some P-38s and Yaks would then be painted with Star Victory decals, rather than black crosses or swastikas, some white and others red. So, as you've made it this far, please like the video to help it spread to more people. If you like the videos that I make and want to help me produce more, please support me in any way you can by going to my website calibanrising.com/support. You can also leave me a super chat tip, or even join my Patreon. Right now you can help by leaving a comment with your thoughts and watching my next video on screen for you right now. It's a good one.